Dr. Douglas Sperry has his PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and is an associate professor of psychology at St. Mary of the Wood College, just across the border in Indiana. Incidentally, I just learned this. He's an accomplished pianist. He has a master's in piano performance. He has various awards for piano performance and pedagogy. I won't name all of them, but I thought that was pretty cool. So, so as a psychologist, he most recently made quite a splash with the publication of an article that I think he'll tell us a little bit about, published in Child Development, in which he and his co-authors failed to replicate the findings of the so-called 30 million word gap between more advantaged and less disadvantaged children. And this and other work of his has been featured in reports by National Public Radio, The Atlantic, the Brookings Institution, etc. He has many awards, among them a Spencer National Academy of Education Dissertation Fellowship and a National Academy of Education Spencer Postdoctoral Fellowship. And earlier this week, my doctoral students and I had a really fun, lively conversation of your work, and we're really excited to have you here in person. So welcome, Dr. Sperry.
Thank you very much.
I hope you will be, if I turn off my camera, I hope you will not be offended. I will be listening avidly.
No, that's fine. Can everybody hear me now? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I just decided it might be better if I tried to use my headset, but I wanted to make sure I have it on correctly. Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I was just really looking forward to coming last year and meeting everyone in person. And as Lindsay said, that we obviously had those opportunities ripped rather rudely away from us. But this is great, and I'm really happy to be here today. So I think I'll just go ahead and start the PowerPoint. Please, if you have any questions or comments while I'm presenting, please just feel free to mention them. And I certainly don't mind if you mention them verbally. I've tried to become more adept at using chat, etc. But I think it might be just as well if we just talk with each other as the need arises. So without any further, and why is it saying that I'm muted?
You are not.
Okay, I don't know why that's, oh, that was, never mind. Okay, I get it. Okay. Okay. As you can see, I'm keeping the title, The Role of Overheard Speech in the Ambient Verbal Environments of Young Children. And that's what I'm really working on currently, as well as a couple other smaller projects. But as Lindsay suggested, I mean, this work does come directly out of the 2018-2019 paper. There's quite a little history there we could talk about for 10 minutes by itself of when it came out in various places. But anyway, I think I refer to it here as 2018, but it's either date it's the same paper. So I will be talking about that briefly to begin with, but I always like to begin with this small piece of video, which now I've practiced and practiced. Oh, there we go.
If we're truly going to restore our country's promise of opportunity for all, then we need to guarantee every American child a great education from the earliest age. We know that right now, during the first 3 years of life, a child born into a low-income family hears 30 million fewer words than a child born into a well-off family. And if a Black or Latino child isn't ready for kindergarten, they're half as likely to finish middle school with strong academic and social skills. By giving more of our kids access to high-quality preschool and other early learning programs, and by helping parents get the tools they need to help their kids succeed, we can give those kids a better shot at the career they're capable of, and the life that will make us all better off. This is one of my top priorities, and I want to thank the growing coalition of researchers, nonprofits, and foundations who've made it one of theirs. This week, I'm challenging even more Americans to join this effort. Let's find new ways to deliver a world-class education to our children, bridge the word gap, and put more young people on a path to success. Together, we can make sure, no matter who you are or where you come from, with hard work and responsibility, you can make it here in America if you try.
I love that clip for several reasons. There's a lot of different emotions associated with that clip, not the least of which is some irony that the closing the word gap conference, White House conference, actually began just as I was finishing the write-up of my dissertation. And as all of you who have finished the write-up of your dissertation know, that's the period of time where you really don't want to learn that there's this major international thing going on about what you're writing about. And so at the last minute, my committee wanted me to do another additional chapter on the ideology around the word gap, which was interesting in of itself. And just kind of briefly, before I actually talk about the word gap, I think there's so many interesting things, so many layers of meaning in that. What's first of all very interesting about that clip, it's very subtle, it goes by fast, but President Obama actually gets the word gap wrong. First of all, the 30 million word number is somewhat metonym for the problem itself. Second of all, it's not calculated from years 1 to 3, and there's just a bunch of errors that have crept into the literature about what the word gap is and how it works and how it was determined, etc. But I think the other another layer of meaning that creeps into that can be discussed in terms of, you know, who's fighting for what here. And there is an ideology surrounding the word gap that that there is certainly within the psychology literature a desire to suggest that all low-income folks have actually, speak very little to their children, as little as the group that Hart and Risley suggested that I'll be talking about in just a bit. And what they ignore often is the fact that there is enormous intra-group differences that often, as I'll show in a bit, swamp the inter-group differences. And Hart and Risley, I don't want to say that I really admire the study in the end, although there are ways in which they played fast and loose with the data. And I hope to give you a little bit more of a sense of that. And not in a way that, is, I think, probably anything they ever thought or would have imagined would have come to the level of blows that this often has at various SRD-CD conferences, et cetera. Or I should say near blows. But I remember one particularly testy meeting at the 2015, was it, SRCD meeting, lots of screaming. Anyway, the point is that we all do want to help kids. I think probably each one of us, since we're interested in this topic, is probably here because our ultimate mission as developmental psychologists, as educators, as policymakers, et cetera, is to find the best possible way to help children succeed, to help them to reach their goals, and also to help parents be effective. And so the question is blind acceptance of the word gap really the best way to proceed to affect those goals? And buried in another layer of conflict, as again, I'll be kind of signaling in a little bit, is the difference between psychologists and anthropologists. And also a lot of educators are grouped in with the anthropological group of people who are very critical of the concept of the word gap because of the way that it sometimes rather unambiguously creates more prejudice or more stereotype against people of color and against people who are not in the professional or middle class. Anyway, more on all of that later as well. But I do like to begin with that particular excerpt from President Obama, and that was sent out as an advertisement, et cetera, for the White House conference on the word gap in 2014. And I think it's particularly interesting even today. So as Lindsay suggested, I'm going to start with a short review, an abbreviated review of the 2018 work for a couple reasons. A, it's all the same corpora that are being used that I'm still using. And B, I think it sets the stage, at least partially, for why I want to look at, or why I'm looking at overheard speech. So first of all, what's the word gap? For any of you who may not be aware of it, it's a concept that emerged from Hart and Risley's landmark 1995 study and meaningful differences. And in that study, they sampled 42 child participants and their families from the Kansas City area. Both Hart and Risley were at the University of Kansas at the time, and they were particularly associated with a housing project daycare complex called the Turner House. And all of their welfare and some of their working class participants came from that complex. It's assumed that most of the professional people were college professionals associated with the University of Kansas. And anyway, so the participants were, as I list there, 13 professional families, middle class, 10 middle class, 13 working class, and 6 welfare families. The children were videotaped, and these videotapes occurred in the early to mid 70s. They were videotaped from 13 to 36 months in age, once per month. And each observation was an hour long. So each child had on average 25 hours of data spanning those 2 years. For that time, this was an enormous study. I mean, at that time, if you can think to typical child language development studies, such as those by Lois Bloom or Roger Brown and Slobin and his crowd, et cetera, most studies had far less data than Hart and Risley ended up with. And it contributed, A, to their not getting the study out until 1995, as anyone who's transcribed can attest to the difficulties of that and the enormous amount of transcription that was involved with 42 times 25 samples. That's like 1,068 or something like that, if I remember correctly. And also the enormous amount of coding that they did. And again, this study, I think, demands our respect, not only because of the influence it's had, but also that it remains remarkably current in many ways, even 25 years later. Okay, let's do it this way. Okay. So these are a very quick summary of the estimates that they provided from Hart and Risley. So and notice this is already one of the layers of kind of fast and loose playing with the data. Although Hart and Risley talk about 4 groups sometimes, they often then reduce it to 3 groups, and they collapse their middle class with their working class samples. And I think there are some reasons that can be discovered about that, but I don't think we'll probably go into that much today. But anyway, the working class now, and this chart represents both their middle class data and their working class data. So as you see, the utterances per hour, professional 487 utterances per hour, and these are adult caregiver utterances. It is assumed in the monograph that they are all that of the mother, although that is never clearly specified. It is talked about, though, as if it is a single caregiver at all points in time, although there are sometimes inferences that it might have been multiple caregivers. Anyway, the child heard 487 utterances from the professional, about 2,153 words per hour. And I need to move the screen because I can't see. And you can then follow through the chart without my reading it. The important thing is if you look in the far right column where you see words by age 4 in millions. So this is another thing that has some, oh, good grief. I need to stop fussing with my mouse. This is another thing that has some ideological significance because actually these are all extrapolated numbers. So if you have to assume that the children were all awake a 14-hour day, and you assume that from birth through age 4, so in other words, 4 complete years of 14-hour days of words at each hour at the rate shown per hour. Now that right there is problematic, and Gilkerson and the Lena folks have actually gotten more reasonable estimates since then. But if you extrapolated those data, you found out then that the professional kids supposedly heard 45 million words by age 4, and the welfare children supposedly heard 13 million words by age 4. 45 minus 13 is 32, not 30 million, but 32 is not quite as, shall we say, sexy of a number as 30. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as quickly. So that was changed to the 30 million word gap. And then there are still, of course, the remaining problems about, are children always awake 14 hours per day, every day? New parents hope not. And do parents always talk to their children every hour per day in the same way that they might talk to their children if a video camera is present? Again, one suspects not, but that's how we get the 30 million word gap. The 30 million word gap, I think, hit at a time that was very ripe for its acceptance into the literature. But even so, we don't really see it getting picked up until after No Child Left Behind law passes in 2001. And I have argued elsewhere that that's part of the metric that makes this study have an extraordinary amount of power. But it fit in very well with a growing body of literature about mother's vocabulary. And I'm going to call this body fitting into the traditional account of vocabulary. So the traditional account suggests that mom's vocabulary and speech does differ across developmental time. It will differ from caregiver to caregiver. So mothers will differ between themselves, but also it's presumed that mothers differ from fathers, mothers differ from children, etc. It does differ across SES levels, and Erica Hoff is actually, probably the first person to describe SES level differences, although her 1991 study did not get nearly the traction initially that Hart and Risley did. But nevertheless, she was the first to describe this, to my knowledge. And also importantly, and a variable that's come under even increased interest recently, is that mother's vocabulary differs across mother's education level. And it's well known and really not very debatable that mother's vocabulary will predict children's vocabulary growth, as several people far more intelligent than I have said, children need to have input. And all vocabulary provides that input, and the more input you get, the more vocabulary growth. So that's really not all that debatable. The next question, though, the next point, I should say, bears more directly on the question of overheard speech, because in the traditional account, it maintains fairly strongly that language development occurs optimally in joint attention episodes, even into the preschool years. So a joint attention episode has been defined by several people, but Tomasello probably has defined them the most clearly. And if you can imagine the way most Western caregivers hold their babies with their arm around their baby, tummy facing tummy, allowing a child who's got head movement by that point to turn around and look at the world, but also very much preferencing that face-to-face contact between infant and caregiver. And then that's the physical or contextual situation for a joint attention episode. And then we have the interactional parts of it where, the caregiver is able to very carefully direct the child's attention supposedly to what's going on in the environment, what that caregiver is talking about. It also then provides a way, by having similar height of the infant, for the infant's eye gaze pattern to be roughly close to what the caregiver's eye gaze pattern is, therefore presumably limiting the number of objects in the environment to which the caregiver might reference. This is shown to be very important and very significant in predicting language learning and early language acquisition, and even in preschool book reading. An alternative account, though, exists to the development of language and vocabulary, and specifically, and that's the language socialization tradition. The language socialization tradition suggests that almost all children become competent speakers within their cultural contexts. So the language socialization tradition doesn't really set out a minimum level of competence that would agree with or be consistent with weird cultures, particularly, in United States cultures, middle-class schoolrooms in America, etc. Rather, it seeks to look at how language is used in a particular cultural context, and thereby shows that regardless of many different ways of language instruction, many different ways of talking with children, that children do become communicatively competent within their context. This tradition maintains steadfastly that language varies systematically within and across cultures. So within cultures from family to family, there will be language use variation, but specifically across cultures, there'll be great differences in the way adults bring their young children to language. That language is organized by a local understanding of how language acquisition occurs, so that not everybody, for example, will acknowledge the same language milestones for first words, etc. That language needs to be studied ecologically and in culturally valid ways, and it should be considered from a cross-disciplinary perspective. The language socialization tradition emerged out of anthropology, but closely allied to developmental psychology, as Eleanor Oakes obviously was trained in anthropology, but Bambi Shefflin was a student of Lois Bloom as well as an anthropologist. So it traces its origin story very closely to both of those fields and is interdisciplinary. Language socialization has been instrumental from the beginning, including Oakes and Shefflin's classic 3 developmental stories, of showing that different cultures privilege different types of attention. So for example, some types of attention are, as opposed to joint attention, I should say. So many cultures privilege what Gaskins and Paradise have called an open attention model, which they describe, I think, very clearly as being wide-angled and abiding, where an individual is paying attention broadly across a range of things at one time and not being focused specifically in the manner of joint attention. Attention is also multimodal, so it's being not only determined by eye gaze and by voice patterns, but it may be determined by touch, it may be determined by caregiver movement, etc. It's characterized by intentional observation, and that much learning is done as the child is a bystander through overhearing. And this is kind of the beginning of our talk about overheard speech. So the language socialization tradition suggests that a lot of learning across cultures is not accomplished in directed speech to the child from the parent, but rather in speech that an adult caregiver may say to accompany his or her actions, or may actually be addressed to other children, and that the child in question is learning it by being a bystander. And finally, that attention can also be through guided participation. And the frequency of different types of attention suggests that other participation frameworks, so participation frameworks, say, of a bystander or an onlooker, other participation frameworks in joint attention may offer viable input for language acquisition. So this is my little diagram to try to encapsulate the traditional view, where the child's verbal environment is kind of presumed to only really include mom's talk to her baby. And that's really all that Hart and Risley seem to be discussing, although there is, I think, reason to think that they may have been discussing other things as well, but they were only clear about there being this one caregiver. And the literature often seems to assume that throughout the entire preschool years that the one caregiver has the most importance. As you know, mom's talk is preferentially measured in experimental studies for a long period of time, far after the first year of life, the first year of talk, the second year of life, when Tomasello most classically discussed joint attention. The language socialization view, however, presents a more complex picture of a verbal environment where all the people in the child's immediate surroundings are talking to each other and talking to the child. So that the child is hearing speech directed to her from mom, from other caregivers, but the child's also overhearing speech between mom and grandpa, between mom and their siblings, etc. So the contrast of these two views led us to do the study that has been referenced so far. And in that study, our hypotheses were that if the data that collected in the tradition of language socialization, and that means ethnographically, would yield a different picture of the amount of vocabulary in homes than data collected using traditional observational methods. And furthermore, it was expected that the amount of speech in homes would vary by culture and by social class. That's not inconsistent with the literature, but we obviously predicted it would perhaps vary in different ways. We also hypothesized that there would be differences in the amount of vocabulary children heard addressed to them by their primary caregivers, as in joint attention, by all interlocutors, also in the form of joint attention, and to and around them by all interlocutors overheard speech. And expected the amount of speech in the homes would vary by culture and social class. The 5 corpora that I used for data analysis were all collected at different times. I'll give a little snapshot of those in just a minute. The important thing is that all of them were collected in an approach called ethnography, which is an approach that foregrounds cultural differences. It relies upon extensive field work by the researcher to acclimate himself to the culture and also to acclimate potential participants to their presence within their context. And that's the rapport building part of the ethnographic approach. The data were all collected observationally. In each case, the recordings were situated within the child's home, and the data were all longitudinal. There were, as I said, 5 corpora, which I'll detail here in just a second, but each one was longitudinal. So here are the 5 research sites: South Baltimore, the Black Belt of Alabama, Jefferson, Indiana, Daly Park in Chicago, and Longwood. Obviously, the specific names are pseudonyms, with the exception of South Baltimore, which is a larger region in Baltimore. The ethnicities are given. All children and families were European American, except for the Black Belt. The economic status, South Baltimore was, all participants were economically poor. In the Black Belt, most of the participants were economically poor, as defined by being on welfare and living in public housing. Some of them would be probably more classified as working class. It was a community within a region of the South, and therefore it is somewhat defined by the fact that it is a single community. The participants in Indiana were working class, Daly Park working class, and then the Longwood sample was a middle class sampling of data that Peggy Miller collected as a contrast for the other working class communities that she studied. The Alabama and the Indiana samples, which my wife and I collected, were rural in disbursement, and the other samples were all urban. This is a snapshot then of the number of participants and the age range of the observations. I'm not going to go through this bit by bit. You will see the samples did range in size from a small N of 3 for South Baltimore to our Jefferson, Indiana sampling of 15, 8 boys and 7 girls. For the most part, the data range from roughly 24 to 42 months. There are some earlier samples in South Baltimore and some later in the Chicago samples. The number of totals transcribed samples that were analyzed also vary, consistent with corpora studies, but 280 total samples for representing a total of 157.5 hours of data were examined. The data were all coded according to standard rules for sorting and labeling vocabulary, rules established by Janelle and Huttenlocher and others. So all vocabulary spoken by primary caregivers, other family members, friends, and youth was all coded. In other words, everything that was that could be understood on the tape, except for speech to and by the researcher, was coded. This coding was done from verbatim transcripts, which had been done across the years for the relative samples. We did not code language to the researcher or by the researcher because it was deemed to be something that would not have normally been there. Obviously, there are always issues with taping and whether or not what we are observing would happen on a day-to-day basis, but that was our attempt to do as well as we could. Vocabulary was sorted across 2 levels. Number 1 by speaker. So 3 levels of speaker: primary caregiver, adult, other adult, or youth, and by addressee. So either the focal child was being addressed or another individual was being addressed. And then within each level, vocabulary was coded according to word types and tokens. So for those of you familiar with language acquisition studies, types are the total number of unique words spoken, different words, and tokens are the total number of words spoken, wherein each type may actually be spoken numerous times. I'd like just to give a snapshot now of the results from the 2018. I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but just to give you a flavor of what was in the paper. This is possibly the primary graph for what we call the first condition. The first condition being the number of word tokens, so the total number of words spoken per hour by primary caregivers to the focal children. And these are only our 5 communities. As you can see, I've arranged them in descending order of number of words. So actually the Black Belt community children heard the most words spoken directly to them only by primary caregivers, with 1,838. By contrast, the Jefferson working class community heard the fewest, but not that many fewer than South Baltimore, by again, just primary caregivers. So this is speech that we suggested was whose amount was most similar to what Hart and Risley provided. Speech by one single caregiver addressed to the focal child within the observation. Before I should leave, I should say there are no significant differences between these groups. Although the Black Belt speech is almost twice as much as Jefferson and South Baltimore, as you can see. Again, the same problem plagues these types of data that plagues a lot of language acquisition studies, in that there are enormous intra-group differences that completely swamp the intergroup differences in terms of variance. And therefore, it's often not likely that you're going to find particular intergroup differences because of that intra-group variance. This is a chart that places the previous chart's numbers, so the primary caregiver's speech to focal children, alongside of the data from Hart and Risley's 1995 study. So as you see, the Kansas professional children still heard more numbers per hour. Now, and just to be clear, these are not extrapolated numbers. These are the actual numbers that Hart and Risley reported from their 25 samples per child for the professional child. So these are very equivalent then to what we coded in our 5 communities. And you'll see that the Hart and Risley data bracket the rest of the data, with the professional group having 2,153 words per hour on the highest side, whereas the Kansas City impoverished, or welfare group as they called them, heard 616 words per hour. The only significant difference in this group is the difference between the Kansas professional group and the Kansas impoverished. So even say the black belt community is not significantly different from the Kansas impoverished. Again, those intra-group differences swamp the intergroup differences with the exception of those two Kansas City communities. And I argued in the 2018 paper that I think that provides us further evidence that those communities were outliers and for various reasons. And the reason I would suggest is that the Kansas impoverished family were all welfare mothers living in housing projects. They were all single mothers. And we have to remember the data were recorded in the early 70s. And I would suggest, and others authors have suggested as well, that that may have encouraged, or that the timing, the political scene around them might have encouraged them really to not talk very much. We'll never know, but it's a hypothesis. By contrast, the professional people are, as I said, assumed to be all university professors. I think that, you know, should give us pause to compare children who are the children of university professors and call them the aspirational goal for all children, because it's a fairly unique group of people. But beyond those interpretations, we have to acknowledge that only the professional and impoverished group from Kansas were significantly different from each other, despite the importance of the 30 million word count. I don't spend much time in this paper talking about the word types. I just wanted to give you one slide that's kind of a brief glimpse. And these are just for our 4 communities. The word types were not addressed extensively by Hart and Risley. They were addressed, but they do not obviously form part of the 30 million word argument, which is a token argument. But just to show that there was a relatively high level of diversity in our samples, they were not without, you know, diversity within word types. And they're also measured, again, one more slide on this, in a measure, a parameter of Malvern and Richards called D, which corrects for different lengths of sampling, et cetera, in language and natural language samples. And it overestimates the number of samples and bootstraps vocabulary estimates to get these D estimates. D has not been frequently used in the United States, yet it's used more in language studies in Great Britain. But I think it's useful, and I am using these data currently in other projects because of the way our data were collected. It's really our only measure of language output, if you will, or how the children actually what the children actually learned, since we did not do the same MacArthur-Bates inventories, etc. Within this chart, the Longwood, the middle class sample, is significantly greater in diversity than the black belt sample. I think I meant to say, and talked over myself, that D is a parameter that estimates type token ratios, but does so with a better balance of sampling. So back to word tokens then, which is the crux of the argument of the 2018 paper. This chart shows the mean number of word tokens spoken by all interlocutors to and around the focal child. So these numbers include both so-called joint attention speech as well as overheard speech. And as you can see, the numbers do increase quite a bit. There is quite a bit of overheard speech, but there's also quite a bit of speech that's directed to the children by other caregivers. I'm just not taking the time to go over that expressly today, but it is, this is the chart that again places those numbers within the context of the Kansas City data. This chart, though, I don't want to be misleading about this chart. I've done it just to kind of give you a flavor for the comparison, but we can't make direct comparisons from this chart because, again, to the best of our knowledge, Hart and Risley didn't measure speech by all interlocutors. They only measured a single interlocutor. So we're really not comparing apples and apples on this chart. I'm just trying to provide it for a glimpse of differences in amounts. But this is kind of the final sum chart that I'd like to close talking about the earlier study with before moving on to more recent things. And that is the amount of the total sum, if you will, of speech in these communities. So the shaded bars are the Kansas City, Hart and Risley samples. And again, that speech is just the speech that is considered to be joint attention from one caregiver to the focal child. So therefore, its most direct comparison in this graph are to the blue bars, which is the speech of the primary caregiver in our 5 communities. Again, you can see though that there's considerable difference, particularly with the 2 poor communities. So in our ethnographically collected data, there was far more directed speech or joint attention speech to the children in the poor communities. The amounts are much more similar for the working class communities. So with Jefferson being slightly less than Hart and Risley and Daly Park being slightly more. The middle class sample for us is slightly more too. Obviously, as we add more speakers and more speech in, the orange and the black bars are going to get more. So they are, again, not a completely fair comparison to the Hart and Risley numbers, but it does, I think, give us a better snapshot of how much language really is in the homes of children if you count all of the people that are routinely in their households. So in sum, we demonstrated there was wide variation across the samples, across families and communities. I didn't share with you the individual samples data for lack of time, but there was enormous difference, intergroup difference. The variation, though, to us seemed more situational than structural. And by that, I mean it seemed more to apply or to be the response to individual family differences rather than SES differences or even necessarily regional, rural, urban differences or ethnic differences. The differences were really who's at home, who's at home during this time. And we would see that even with more micro analysis of individual sampling. Moms speak less when all the siblings are home. So if you happen to be taping at a time when all the kids are home from school, the other children are going to be talking more, mom's going to be talking less. Differences also in what needs to be discussed. If the language at that moment in the family's life was about play, that generates a different amount and a different type of talk than if a particular household duty, like getting a meal prepared or saying goodbye to dad, etc. Those situations all engender differences in what and how much is being talked. There is one caveat, and that additional family members may represent a more enduring or structural source of variation. So we haven't yet, I don't think, really understood the role of younger children and siblings. The old saw, I guess, of the relationship of siblings' speech to that of a language learning child is that the more siblings there are, the slower the language development is. And that may or may not be true. Our data, though, I would say, at least with a cautionary note, don't seem to suggest that. Actually, I didn't share this particular chart with you, but the youth members, when a lot of siblings were talking, actually the vocabulary diversity grows. Children say different words and they talk about different things than adults do. And that seems to kind of up or to increase the language diversity, which would obviously impact vocabulary growth. In our study, there was no clear relationship between social class and quantity of vocabulary. And in fact, the community that was most similar in terms of socioeconomic and cultural aspects to Hart and Risley's welfare community was our Black Belt community, in that both communities were African American and they both were relatively impoverished. And yet our African American community actually, the caregivers, the primary caregivers alone spoke the greatest number of words, actually very close to the amount that the professional caregivers in the Hart and Risley study spoke. So that particular result was very unexpected given the current literature on the word gap, and I think strongly suggests that we can't rely on enormously global indicators of SES or of ethnicity to discern how much language particular children are hearing. There did appear to be differences in quality of vocabulary as measured by our diversity measure D, but in not overall number of word types. So in sum, there was variation across conditions, the three conditions being primary caregiver to child, all interlocutors to child, and all speech around the child, measured in the mean number of tokens. Multiple interlocutors surrounded the child in each community. All interlocutors were viable members of conversations around the child. That result wasn't surprising given the language socialization account. Children are presumed within that account to learn in multiple conversational configurations in multiple contexts. The result is provocative, though, given the assumptions surrounding the 30 million word gap and the attention paid to joint attention and research. Also, there was variation across conditions and mean number of word types and vocabulary diversity. I'm not going to spend more time on that for right now. So turning now to current research, given the fact that we found that there was so much overheard speech, the question remains, does overheard speech make a difference? And for those of you who've read the 2018 paper and possibly some of the replies to it, you'll know that a lot of the replies that were critical of the paper centered on the fact that it's not usually overheard speech is not usually considered to be an important or a significant contributor to overall vocabulary development. I would like to offer, though, right now that there are really very few studies on overheard speech at this point, and it's a area that needs more development and it certainly needs more fine-tuning. What we do know so far is that from experimental evidence, we know that young language learners can learn vocabulary, as the work of Akhtar, others, and Schneidman et al. Have shown. And they also can learn syntax. So Cindy Fisher's work at Illinois is largely centered around learning syntactic concepts through overheard speech. The question, though, remains if they do actually learn it in everyday contexts. And that is the question that people brought to bear in critiques of the 18 article. And there is also experimental evidence, or at least observational quasi-experimental evidence, I should say, that they don't really learn words through overhearing contexts. Even in cultures such as the Yucatec Mayan, where it's been shown that the majority of vocabulary in everyday life is presented in a context that has to be called overheard. By contrast, though, we know that older children do learn things like narrative, and they learn narrative and memory concepts through overheard speech. So it presents a real conundrum of how do we resolve these issues? Why is there a discrepancy between these accounts? Some suggestions for this discrepancy have included the fact that there's not been much of an effort to categorize speech around the child as to whether or not the child's attending to it, or whether or not it's relevant to the child itself. So in other words, overheard speech in these accounts tends to be lumped together into one big category. I shouldn't say tends to be, to this date it all has been lumped together in one big category. So speech is either child directed from a primary caregiver or child directed from another caregiver. Schneidman does make those distinctions, or everything else is just overheard. And as Akhtar has stated, there are other variables that might privilege or hinder whether or not a child pays attention to overheard speech. The identity of the speaker, for example, different socioeconomic, contextual, or cultural factors, and simply the familiarity of a child with hearing overheard speech in general. For example, we might imagine that a child who spends most of its day with a single caregiver in a, home situation with one stay-at-home parent might, have much of of his or her sleeping hours during the time when there's a lot of possibility for overheard speech between parents who've returned from work or siblings who've returned from school, etc. By contrast, children who spend a great amount of their day in other care situations, daycares or preschools, might be more familiar with multiple conversational strains occurring simultaneously and perhaps might be more responsive to it. My point is that the research is not at any way able at this point to make any of those distinctions. We're really at a very preliminary point in understanding and characterizing what overheard speech looks like. So my work that I've been doing now is an analysis of our two American communities. So namely the Alabama African American community and the Indiana European American community. And I'm interrogating the contribution of overheard speech in the child's environment in a quantitative way by coding. Number one is the speech about the child. And number two is the child paying attention to it. And I'll give more on that in a minute. And also in a more qualitative way by trying to provide a phenomenological characterization of the forms and functions of overheard speech within different participation frameworks. So I'll go to the next slide, I guess. So all speech that's not addressed to the focal child is being coded. And I have been coding a selection of a deliberate selection of transcripts that included the most overheard speech to give me the broadest range or the broadest picture of how it's being used. The about the child or not about the child and the child's attention level are, I'm calling quantitative coding. It's codes that we can actually count and actually count the number of tokens heard in those particular contexts. Attention, as you might imagine, is frightfully difficult to code. And I have ended up having some success in getting reliability on a three-pronged, rather gross estimate of attention that I'm calling heightened attention versus open versus limited. Heightened attention is what I'm coding as what we might imagine the child paying to joint attention speech, although I would argue that children don't always pay attention to joint attention speech. But we might assume that that's the sort of attention that's going on. As I say, the child's on alert. So there is behavioral evidence in the transcript then that the child's really paying attention to a conversation that the child's overhearing. Open attention, I'm likening to the child that's hanging out. Child's giving evidence behaviorally by gaze patterns or by activities that they're monitoring multiple activities. They're monitoring multiple conversations as measured by gaze, etc. Limited attention is being coded when children we have direct behavioral evidence that they're not paying attention to the conversation. Their conversation seems to be intently focused on another conversation, possibly one in which they are engaging in joint attention, or to another activity. So if the focal child is perhaps in a corner of the room, a corner of the camera shot, where they are, very engaged with a particular toy and possibly making their own pretend sounds, I would code that as limited attention to the other conversations in the room. I'm also then doing a more phenomenological or qualitative coding based on Rogoff et al.'s 2016 intentional learning paper, where I'm looking at episodes of overheard speech to see what sorts of informal learning can be gained from paying attention to the speech. How is the talk organized in the child's life? So, very simply, who are the characters? How are the characters talking about the child? That's all plays a part in it. Is there something that would motivate the child to listen to that talk? And can we say that, what's instructional about that talk? Are different principles being socialized, etc. I'd like to give you now a few brief examples of coding, and as many of you who have seen qualitative studies, I perhaps need to apologize in the beginning for some of the difficulties of trying to convey coding schemes and qualitative data. In this first example, though, of the coding scheme, this is Wesley, who's 22 months old, and his family is a rural Indiana family, European American. He is playing, or in the context, in the scene, if you will, with his brother Wally, who's 6, and his sister Katie, who's 5, and their mom is around. And the scene starts briefly up the stairs from the basement of their family room in their home. In the family room, though, once you get into the room, there's a large toy box next to the wall and several chairs and a couch in the room. Most of the time during this observation, all the children are on the floor playing, although there's some wandering around. At the beginning, Wesley is upstairs and he's coming down the stairs, and he stops briefly for a moment near the bottom of the stairs when he hears his older brother Wally say, "Hey, what's a spider doing in there?" And he's referring to a spider that's in a large toy box. Mom says, "What?" And Wally says, "A spider." Well, Wesley hears the word spider and screams, "Mommy." So initially, we coded his participation before this scene as open attention because he seemed to be generally paying attention to everything that was going on in the room, not in a really highly focused manner. But obviously, once something about Wally's statement, either possibly the word spider, possibly the emotion that is attached to the way the words are saying, focus his attention to a heightened level where he actually then screams and he runs to Mom, signaling that he has heard and understands the word spider and that something kind of scary is going on. There's some intervening talk, and then Wally says, "This right here goes on top." And at this point, I should say, the kids are putting together a farm set. And Wally, the older brother, is really, really desirous of getting the fence to the farm set put together. And he's getting very frustrated because the pieces don't quite want to go together the way he would like them to. And then occasionally other tragedies occur, which we'll talk about in a minute. His sister Katie picks up a toy television from the farm set and says, "This thing goes in the house. This thing goes in the house, but it's broken." Mom's still playing with them. She says, "Uh-huh." Wesley, our focal child, is remaining in silence, and he's playing with the truck. He doesn't seem to, at this point, be paying a lot of attention. He is in the scene, he is in proximity, but we've coded that as limited attention to those words. Katie repeats, "There's a TV," to Wally. Wally says, "Here's the water trough, a water trough." And there's more intervening talk. And then all of a sudden, Wesley notices a toy cow and cries out, "Oh, cow." And he crawls over the toy box. "Oh, cow." So he has sort of re-engaged then in the farmyard play scene, and we counted that as open attention. Meanwhile, Wally's starting to get frustrated. "Who's tearing down all the pieces?" referring to this fence. Okay, there comes a period now of heightened attention, possibly drawn by Wally's anger. So Kate, "Where's the table?" when you know, and Wes says, where, looking around. So he's clearly attending to what Katie's saying. "Where's the table? I'm trying to find the table." Where at? Where? Importantly, at this point, Katie's not addressing Wesley directly. She's addressing Wally more. Wally's not really paying that much attention, but Wesley obviously is. In the process of looking for this table, Wesley knocks the fence down with his truck. Wally gets angry. "Everyone's getting me messed up while I'm trying to build this." And Mom says, "Hey, Wally, he's just trying to help. He's pulling the truck in there to unload some sheep." And then Wesley says, "Load the sheep. Get out the car then." Well, what's interesting about this last coda to this episode is that, first of all, there's been no talk about loading sheep or loading the truck. This is the first time that the word sheep or the word load, or in this case unload, has entered the transcript. Mom is obviously directly chastising Wally for his angry tone and for his impatience, and yet clearly Wesley is engaging in heightened attention. He picks up on the word. He uses Mom's words to exculpate himself in Wesley's eyes and to proceed on with his play. This is another slightly more involved example, but another example I'd like to show of how children can be seemingly not paying attention and then all of a sudden change. So in this particular scene, Roland's been very happy. I should say this is in Alabama, so these are our African-American participants. Roland's been very happily pointing out pictures and sales catalogs and creating small stories around them. Grandma wants to shift the scene. She's bored with Roland's storytelling right at that moment. And she shifts to wanting to talk about nursery rhymes and having the kids recite their nursery rhymes. That was a frequent activity that the Alabama mothers and other caregivers liked to sort of show off their children. She keeps asking Roland to say his nursery rhyme, and Roland says kind of yes, sort of indifferently, kind of lackadaisically paying attention to her. Obviously, that's all directed speech. Grandma, though, finally, as I say, solicits the helps of the reserves, in this case, Roland's sister, LaShonda, and his cousin, Aaliyah. Grandma asks Aaliyah, what's the nursery rhyme he been saying? LaShonda jumps in, Jack, and then Roland, now he's realized the attention's not on himself anymore. He all of a sudden can participate. I know how to say it. So clearly, even though this speech is not directed to him, Grandmom has changed the focus of the conversation. He nevertheless is paying heightened attention to it and possibly therefore benefiting from any language learning within that situation. The scene goes on from there, and that sort of interaction persists throughout several more minutes in the transcript, where LaShonda and Aaliyah both at times ally themselves with each other against Roland. Roland, wants to get in. He wants to be sure that he's the center of attention for my wife, etc. So these are some quick results from our analyses of the overheard speech in Alabama. So these are our two coding categories: the level of attention, heightened versus open versus limited, and the other factor of whether or not the speech is about the child. In a chi-square analysis, these differences were significant. As you can see, speech that is about the child, children are paying a heightened degree of attention to it. From a qualitative perspective, that's not difficult to understand. Often their name is being mentioned. Often, as in the case with Roland, it's about an activity that they were just engaged with. The point of the matter, though, is that the speech is not about them at that time. Many of these instances are cases where, say, dad or mom has just gotten home and the other parent is regaling the absent parent with stories of the day, and those stories naturally include the activities of their children, and the children are paying very close attention to that, even if they're not being specifically addressed. So that's the overheard speech in Alabama. And then this is the similar chart for Indiana. Again, it was a significant chi-square. Again, we see this a similar but not identical shaping of the results, again with heightened attention about the child being the highest category. What's interesting, I think, about this chart is that the not about the child speech was shared relatively equally in terms of attention levels between open and limited attention. I haven't actually gotten to pursue my intuitions about that finding yet, but I suspect it's because it's a little bit less clear for the Indiana children when they're being talked about due to the nature of how the adults are referencing them. The Indiana children are often engaged more in independent behaviors. And I'm going to talk in just a second about interdependence versus independence in these communities. And whereas the Alabama kids are often much more involved in large group activities or conversations where it would not be as difficult for them to ascertain that they're being talked about or not. And therefore that may, if I go back quickly, suggest a reason why the amount of the amount of attention they pay to talk that's not about them is slightly less than it is for the Indiana people. Not a great deal, but enough, I think, to be interesting. So I'd like to move finally, and I may have to, I apologize for the way that this is presented in advance, because I found relatively difficult to try to capture this analysis, and it is a qualitative analysis, but and this is what I'm working on, as trying to see overheard speech as a context for informal learning in the manner that Rogoff discusses. This coding is still ongoing, but I described it briefly, but I'd like to talk briefly about one tentative result, in that I believe that the overheard speech is being characterized or structured in a way that within the Alabama community focuses on a socialization goal of interdependence among family members, that we're all in it together sort of thing. We talk together, we play together, we interact together. Everybody's part of the conversation. And that's a real feeling one gets when reading those transcripts. As opposed to in the Indiana corpus, there's more of a sense that there's a goal of independence or conversational independence being socialized. So in Indiana. So with Wesley's family, for example, the example I just said, we could go back, we could show that mom addresses each child apart from each other. Mom doesn't really typically address the children in a group. The children are all playing together, but her comments don't tend to be corporal. They tend to be individual to one child or the other, whichever child she's seeking to manage at that point in time. Moms don't tend to manage children as a group in Indiana as they do in Alabama. In that particular scene, I don't have the actual language in that scene for the actual transcript in that scene for matters of time and length, but there is a great deal of time when mom encourages Wesley to depart from the local scene of the farmyard building, because she knows that he's getting on Wally's nerves and she's just trying to mitigate the conflict. And so she's encouraging Wesley to drive his truck around, to have a different toy. And we do see a glimpse of that when she explains to Wally the fact that he was just trying to unload the sheep. And mom's focus on individual child transgressions rather than viewing all children as contributing to an interaction. And that's very different from the Alabama community, where, if one child gets yelled at, they tend to all get yelled at. To demonstrate familial interdependence in Alabama, though, I'd like to go to just a couple of brief episodes. This is with the focal child, Alicia, who was 24 months old, and her brother, Ronald. And Ronald was not always wanting to be there, but he was an incredibly agreeable big brother. And mom always wanted him to be here, as she says in this particular excerpt. Ronald, come back here. He tried to get away. Because you better acting with her than anybody. Come on back here with Alicia. So Ronald is desired in that scene. Mom specifically wants him around because she knows that Alicia will act better and play better with her brothers here. Another similar example comes from an Alabama child named Daphne and her older sister Diane and their mom. Again, they're in the family room. Diane's been practicing her spelling words, and she's actually taking piano lessons at the time, and she doesn't like it. And when she's done, she's trying to get out of the kitchen to her room without going to practice the dreaded piano. So she's trying to sneak out, and mom catches her in the act, but not really entirely to practice piano, as we'll see. So mom says, Daphne, okay, Diane's going to go in there and play with you with the balloons for a while. Go in there and sit on the floor with her, Diane. Play with her with the balloon and be nice to her. There's a little side conversation between my wife and Daphne, but importantly, then mom says, and talk to her. She missed you. She hasn't seen you all day. So it's very concerted effort on the part of both of these mothers to get their older siblings involved in the younger siblings' lives. I'd like to finally share one rather lengthy episode of fostering independence in Indiana. as kind of a concluding way of demonstrating how the Indiana mothers wanted or seemed to want to treat each child separately and used overheard speech and how it worked through their children's lives to accomplish those goals. So in this following lengthy episode, Mom sets a personal goal of managing both 2-year-old Kaylee, the focal child, and 6-year-old Keith as separate interlocutors, each with their own conversational designs. In so doing, she often pays more attention to the actions and talk of Kaylee and her coloring, since she thinks Keith is better able to entertain himself as he alternately looks on at what his mom and sister are doing or engages with a television program. Throughout much of the episode, then, Keith's contributions seem disjointed, veering from talking about Kaylee's coloring to asking about having a chocolate chip cookie to mentioning random pictures on the television. In the middle of this interaction, a baby appears on the television. After Keith mentions, rather excitedly, that there's a baby on television and Mom offhandedly acknowledges it, he says, "Mom, you were a baby?" Mom, "Uh-huh." "Are you a baby?" A long, long time ago." And then Keith laughs. Meanwhile, I did not write the red codes, and this would definitely be limited attention because Kaylee's just drawing. I's going to school. I have 3 of them, picking up the crayons. And then Mom returns her attention to Kaylee. Moving forward, though, beyond this short scene, Keith's verbal contributions have been very much in the moment, referring to whatever thought crossed his mind. And in that context, Mom's quick and short responses, the responses that that Kaylee would overhear, seem appropriate. But this talk about the babies is special, especially given my wife's and my work on narrative. It follows quickly behind that comment about the baby on the television, and in a different context, Keith's comments would have been a fertile ground for the co-construction of a narrative between Mom and Keith. In our data, moments like these often bloom into conversational reminiscences, with adult caregivers scaffolding children's contributions, particularly if the child that is reminiscing is seen to be the focal child. But here, Kaylee is the focal child, and nothing comes of Keith's topic proffer. As the episode proceeds, Keith changes his focus to coloring on a more full-time basis, clearly acquiescing to the activity of the day. However, he seeks to provide some individual interest to his participation by wanting to color with a pencil rather than with crayons. Several critical exchanges intervene between Mom and Keith concerning his poking a hole in the paper with the pencil. Mom, "Keith, you can't color with a pencil." "Why?" "You need a crayon." "I don't need a crayon, I need a pencil." "When I went like this, I went make a hole in it." And he pokes the pencil on the paper, and he was clearly desiring of making the hole with it. He knew exactly what he was wanting to do. Mom says, "Quit," and she tears a page out of the book, and then she turns her focus back to Kaylee. Ironically, at this point, Keith began singing a song with Blue Clues on the television. "Thanks for doing your part. You sure are smart. Me and you, we can do this game," which I think is very interesting since Mom is very much setting the children apart and not jointly playing at all. Later, when Keith grows weary, he attempts to juggle his pencil in the air. Apparently, Mom views this change of activity as potentially disruptive to the equilibrium she's established. She proceeds to marginalize Keith's independent activity, addressing him directly in their longest mutual interchange to this point in the observation. Except for the above interchange involving 4 conversational turns, Keith's comments to this point either have gone unheeded by Mom or have engendered no more than 1 or 2 short responses. Although this interchange spans no more than 3 complete conversational turns, it is especially marked as the one above, being begun by Mom in a critical manner, this time accompanied by deictic insistence. "Cookie Monster," she says, as she points to a specific picture in the color book in a rather demonstrative way, showing Keith how he should redirect his energy, "with his cookies." And Keith says, "Yeah," and he tries to reach up for the book and takes it, but Mom holds on to it, not letting him get it. Mom says, "Bunch of cookies." And Keith says, "Yeah, I want to have it." Mom says, "Want to color it?" "Yeah, I want to color with a different color." And so he puts down his pencil and he leans over to get crayons. "I want this one." Holds up a crayon. "Mom, I want this one." At that point, Mom hands the book to Keith, and Keith shakes his head quickly, and then he sets about to coloring. So in this interaction, we see that Mom swiftly engineered Keith's compliance, getting him to stop juggling the pencil by specifically pointing to the book and a picture she presumed would intrigue him. By not relinquishing the book when Keith first reaches for it, she makes coloring it even more appealing, to the point that Keith abandons the pencil, which Mom heretofore disapproved of, and chooses a crayon. So she accomplishes two socialization goals with Keith, and meanwhile overall socializes, in my opinion, this sense of independence and the fact that this overheard speech isn't necessarily all that important for Kaylee to listen to. So in sum, throughout this episode, Mom has been socializing, in my opinion, an independent self in each of her children, reifying the activity of Kaylee through her attention to her, and helping Keith to be happy alone in his activity through minimal encouragement of his conversation proffers and careful management of any effort he makes to get out of hand. When Peace appears on the verge of being disturbed, she quickly and adeptly changes her interactional style, but once Keith has acceded to her will, she rapidly resumes her prior participation formats. So in sum, I'd like to suggest that overheard speech reports very everyday routine thoughts and activities occurring around the child. I haven't specifically said this with every example, but I think all of us who are parents recognize the relatively quotidian, day-by-day activities. Overheard speech, like frankly joint attention speech, is not about some unusual topic. It's just about the goings-on that we have every day. I also like to suggest that caregiver socialization goals are enacted through overheard speech. And even if we don't in the end find out that overheard speech is critically important for the learning of vocabulary, in fact, we can see that overheard speech plays an important role in how children are taught to be and children are taught how to act. We have, I think, demonstrated that children preferentially attune to overheard speech when it's about them. They seem to maintain a high degree of open attention to other overheard speech as well, perhaps monitoring it to determine if they need to focus on it more intently. And finally, while it remains to be seen if everyday overheard speech predicts growth in specific areas of language, evidence suggests that it can and does have an important influence in the child's life. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you. I'll try to get rid of my screen and ask for questions.
That was really great. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
If we were in person, we'd all clap for you.
Oh.
Okay, I think Susan Wilson, if you'd like to speak up.
Oh, no, sorry. I was just clapping. So thank you.
Oh, those are claps. I thought that was a hand. Okay, let me scroll through. We have a big audience here. I'm going to scroll through and see if I have any hands. Okay. Well, while people are collecting their thoughts, I noticed that although the Alabama group was African American and the Indiana group was not, you stopped short of trying to generalize to perhaps this is an African American habit of trying to promote interdependence or vice versa. Would you?
Yeah, I perhaps didn't say that, but yes, I think that's the overall goal that I'm trying to suggest, is that it's, I think, possibly at least within that particular group, it is a desire to socialize as interdependence. Now, whether that extends to other groups or not, I think that's, more fraught with interpretation difficulties. But I definitely think that there's, other evidence within these families that sort of triangulate this result, that they were incorporating, or they were encouraging, this interdependence, not only in homes, but in the daycares. And my wife and I volunteered at the community center for most of the time while we were there, until we had our own son and were otherwise engaged. And the corporate existence was very important. And working together and playing together was very important. So I wouldn't want to extend any of these data broadly to all African Americans or all European Americans, but I do think that there, at least within that community, is that socialization goal, and it may be characteristic of other African American communities as well.
Okay. Oh, here's a question from Tamara.
Yeah. Okay, I've got it up in the chat here. Do you think the Alabama group difference to the other due to their geographic location and the history of violence against Blacks? How much do you think that it is part of the socialization process? That's a very good question, obviously. We definitely have quotes that are not part of this project of awareness within this community of violence against the community. And although the quotes that we have in our caregiver interviews were more centered around the fact that those particular families had chosen to move back to rural Alabama from other locations in the north, like Detroit or Cleveland, to which presumably they had had family members go during the Great Migration, and that they had migrated back or emigrated or moved back to Alabama to get out of the dangers of the city, if you will. I don't really want to draw larger comparisons because these data were collected a long time ago. So I don't think they should be interpreted within recent developments of Black Lives Matter, et cetera, although they may very well be, share common threads with that. And definitely just because we become more aware of it in recent months because of Black Lives Matter and various police injustices, doesn't mean that African Americans in the 80s and 90s weren't well aware of the long history of violence. That said, I think it's possible. I think it's intriguing to think that these sorts of socialization goals may be enacted across generations as a response to wanting to be part of a community when that community feels threatened, et cetera. But that question is really far beyond our data and what we could ever hope to prove with the language data with 2-year-olds. However, I do think that the interdependence, the focusing on being all together, sharing resources, sharing not only physical resources, toys, books, et cetera, but also conversational resources is very much a part of the socialization process for those families. Again, it's intriguing to think about how that may have developed across years of oppression, but our data certainly, I don't think are substantial enough to answer that question.
Yeah, I can certainly, as you were reading through the transcripts, I related to the Indiana mother who just wanted to minimize the chaos. Because that's always my instinct too, is just keep everyone calm,
right.
So this was really interesting to imagine what if that were my primary value? What if I had different goals? My house might look very different. And I think, tell me if I got this wrong, when you showed the type data, which I don't think was published in that 2018.
No.
So was I mistaken in seeing that it was the Black Belt families there that also had the most types of words spoken?
Yes, they had the most types, but interestingly, the diversity ratio was the lowest. And that I think is, although I'm not sure my statistics is good enough to completely interpret Malvern and Richard's parameter creation, but I think, even the D ratio is still somewhat sensitive to the amount of speech, as are all type token ratios. So even though it's less sensitive than just a simple type token ratio, I think the D ratio in Alabama is probably lower on average because of the sheer amount of speech that's happening in those tapes. But you're right, the Alabama data actually, they had the highest average number of types per episode.
Because as I read the child development paper, I couldn't help but think that the type measure, because that's the one, it seems to me that the focus on tokens has always been a little misguided because who cares? If it's
Right.
if vocabulary is a stronger predictor of these achievements that we supposedly care about, then why is everyone? But if it turns out that the so-called disadvantaged families also have at least equivalent levels of type data, then what are we even, like, are there, I guess your point is there are no disparities to name that we've been able to.
Well, I think that there are disparities, but not as predictable as we think they are.
Uh-huh.
I think that we're going to have to get much more sensitive in terms of not only measuring disparities, but also in trying to remedy them, which I think, then sends us to curriculum studies and classroom studies, and, that old classic idea of the mismatch between middle-class white school curricula and children of color's background as they enter those classes. But to get back to your other point, I think that's really critical point that gets glossed over in the word gap research. And unfortunately, our data can't speak to it. I wish they could, but Meredith Rowe has, I think, one of the best papers out, 2012, I think, or 2013, 12, I'm pretty sure, where she shows that in the earliest stages, and I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I think it's basically between 18 and 30 months of age, it's amount of language, so tokens, that predicts vocabulary growth. And then in her next stage, which I believe is 30 to 42 months, again, hopefully I'm getting this right, it's actually diversity. So in that case, it would be types that predicts language development, or quality. If they often, that word quality gets tossed about, and we don't necessarily know if they mean it's diversity of vocabulary or if how it's addressed in terms of speech acts, etc. But she's talking about types. And then in the next group from 42 to 54, it's the amount of decontextualized speech that predicts vocabulary. So that analysis, I think, is a much more sensitive analysis of how children are naturally going to grow over time. And much like Vygotsky would talk about, we are scaffolding development. Different things are going to scaffold language acquisition. That only makes sense, at different times. That optimal language acquisition would be scaffolded in different ways. And that, I think, gets kind of lost in the typical word gap argument, and in remedies to just give Lena devices to children and our parents and say, have your kids talk more. It's like, well, that's fine, and maybe it actually is the best remedy for very early language learning children, maybe in the 12 to 24 month age. But children can't possibly be as influenced by that as they get closer to school age, because they're going to go to school and they're going to hear their friends across the room talk about something, and they're going to be right in there overhearing this and responding to it. So clearly children become very adept at overheard speech and using it as they get older. So I just don't think, I think we know a lot of those results, but they haven't been crafted into the word gap findings, because the word gap measure is just so blunt and easy. It's just a really easy weapon to wield.
And it's so attractive because it seems fixable.
It seems fixable, exactly. And I think that's why, if you look at like Google citations, Hart and Risley got it's just almost a flat line until around 2002. And then the growth in citations goes up exponentially. And I really think it's No Child Left Behind, and that desire for really quantifiable, easily fixable things. And it's easy to grab on to talk more.
Yeah, just talk to your kids more.
Yep.
That'll fix everything. Yeah. I'm looking at the time. I'm tempted to ask one more question, but I know that we've kept you quite a while.
Oh, I'm fine. If you're all not bored with me, I'm fine.
Okay. Okay, so this is asking you to do something that you probably can't or don't want to, but so you mentioned just a minute ago that maybe more inclusive, culturally sensitive curricula might draw out formerly untapped potential or abilities in students. But I also, correct me if I'm wrong, sense you saying that these brute measures, quantitative measures of achievement aren't, we're kind of misguided in looking to them at all. So would you prefer that we keep using these measures, go ahead and measure kids' vocabulary, but only after they've been exposed to a curriculum that is relevant to them, or give them the curriculum and at the same time do away with all of these benchmarks that we're currently obsessed with as culture?
I love those questions, although I have to answer them with a caveat that that's obviously not my field of expertise at all. But we do, I mean, with my wife works more on narrative, although we've worked on it together, and we actually just submitted a paper on how children enter into the story, we called it. And we, well, I think I talk about in the other paper I sent you, the European Journal of Social Theory paper, talk about culturally sustaining pedagogy and how I really think that's what's necessary. Now, whether or not we use the benchmarks, I think that's debatable because I'm sensitive, very sensitive to arguments by many Black educators, like Lisa Delpit, for example, that, white mainstream English is the language of power, and we should give all children access to that. And that we have to kind of acknowledge political realities to say that, this is the language of power. It's not likely going to go away anytime soon. And it is interesting to see, I think, the degree to which African American vernacular English has become more mainstream, especially when you listen to news reports, et cetera. And I'm really so happy to see that at one level, because to me, it's emblematic of where I think curricula should go, and that curricula should be broader and more diverse for all children. I mean, we often, my wife and I at least, have always, bemoaned the fact that we are so, well, my wife is actually at one point was relatively bilingual in Spanish and English, but I'm just almost devotedly monolingual. And, our children are devotedly monolingual. And what a shame it is that we don't teach, say, Spanish in all, schools. I mean, our country is going to be bilingual in the next 40 or 50 years, if it's arguably not already. And wouldn't everybody, I mean, second language research, bilingual research, et cetera, does nothing but show how in the end children are better off when they're multilingual. They learn more, they have cognitively richer experiences. They may not get into the system quite as quickly as they would when they're monolingual in the early years, but by the early years of elementary school, they are doing better when they're bilingual. And all other things assumed to be equal. Obviously, we can't talk about children who've recently immigrated, et cetera, but children who've been exposed to a broadly multilingual curriculum fare better. And I have been extremely influenced by people like Ann Haas Dyson at Illinois, who talks about, her ideas that, all children need to be working with all sorts of stories, all sorts of narrative experiences, and that they would all be richer for learning a wealth of information that I think is very consistent with culturally sustaining pedagogy, that we can sustain other people's cultures by learning about them ourselves. Why should we expect that minority people just learn majority culture? Why can't we learn minority culture as well and be exposed to it? Our argument then is, if especially European American teachers, who I think are all, for the most part, well-meaning, as we said earlier at the beginning, we all want the same thing. We want our children to have the best possible lives they can. And, but we need to have access to that. A European American teacher is going to have to learn about story schemas or, cultural language patternings, etc., to teach them, or to acknowledge them, even to even recognize them sometimes, as Corsaro's work shows, in the same way that minority families have to learn majority practices. But we've got to get the information out there so that people who are steeped in the language, stories, etc., of one culture have access to what they need to teach and what they need to foster. I think I may have wandered from your question. Did I answer it?
Well, as I prefaced my question, there's no answer
Right,
to my
no.
question. So no, everything you said made sense.
So I think, is this Jessica, I think. Would you agree that someone would really need to understand a culture intimately to understand the research? I'm not sure if Jessica means this particular research, but should researchers take more cultural courses? Yes. I definitely think that we need to understand, or be able to at least appreciate. The anthropologist in me says we can never be anything except ourselves. I can never be anything except a white male of my age who was raised in Nebraska, and etc., and is devotedly Midwestern. And that's the entire background of the ethnographic approach, is that before you even turn on the video camera, you have immersed yourself in the culture so that you have a better appreciation for what's going on. Does overheard language, tokens, or types predict how much time is spent reading to the child? No, it doesn't. And what the language feature that might be predicted by how much time is spent reading to the child is decontextualized speech, which, as I said from the Rowe paper, probably by the time children are 3.5 or so, is doing a better job of predicting language growth than either types or tokens.
Did you want to say something, Brett?
No, that's good.
Okay.
That was my question.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And Jessica, I don't know how to direct message you, but please unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you? So
Hi, Jessica.
hi. And one of the studies, and when we were learning about anthropological psychology, one of the things that we were talking about is linguistics. And I know that this is talking about the research in hearing language and the amount of words that children have. But one of the things that we were talking about in other cultures is they actually have them practice navigating through those different languages. So as you talked about, I really dislike the term of a language of power, but I understand what you're saying. But I understand that American English is the more dominant. It's our standard language across the US.
Yeah.
Right. So, but would it be okay, or what are your thoughts on having the time to do socialization and practice utilizing? I think we're doing it anyway, but if for teacher prep training to actually teach when it's appropriate, like how to navigate through that system. So example being in Japanese culture, we were looking at a video with Japanese preschoolers, and that they actually have them purposefully doing socialization training and navigating through when to use different types of dialect and language. Do you think that would make a difference as well, as far as when we look at teacher prepping and understanding and being able to assist with these so-called word gaps in literacy?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think you've hit the nail on the head, so to speak. Now, obviously, it's a hard job, to teach teachers, pre-service teachers, all of these things. But I absolutely think that they need exposure to it, and they need exposure to sociolinguistics, to pragmatics, which I'm sure you probably discussed in your anthropological linguistics studies. And children, there are studies that show that children learn that sort of material very well. And in fact, The only people that don't seem to learn it are the people who aren't routinely exposed to it because they are in a devotedly monolinguistic background. But even children, say like myself, who grew up in a very white state at a very, I mean, when I was growing up, Nebraska was 97% white. But even when you're in a place where the majority of people around you are talking like you do, you still learn that you should talk differently in church than you talk at home. If you have a child who happens to say a word that they heard at home that you'd rather they not say at church, you certainly tell them that on the way home from church, that that was a private word we used. And we learn all sorts of things, and children learn all sorts of things about language use or pragmatics all the time. And the issues that you're discussing about are just other versions of pragmatics and language use. When is it okay to write this way? When is it okay to talk this way? When might it be better to talk a different way or write a different way? And I'd like to believe, and maybe I'm naive or ingenuous, I'd like to believe that those concepts could be taught without any implication that one way is superior or not. And I understand, for example, the reluctance you expressed about talking about the language of power, and I agree with you. It's a fairly standard term within pragmatics. So I certainly don't want to take credit for it. It's not my term, but it's, it does infer something as the language of power or the dominant language or something, that something is better or worse, or something else is worse. And I think, again, maybe I'm naive, but I'd like to think that we could teach children to get away from that, and just that, well, in this situation, this is possibly a better way to talk, or this is a better use of words here. And maybe this is a time when you should, for example, be answering a question in class very directly with a particular definition like correct answer. Conversely, this is a time when you should let your creativity flow free, and whatever language resources you have to express your creativity, you need to bring to fore there. And to help children understand that all of those resources are very rich, and they convey different meanings at different times, and they really express the breadth of who we are as humans.
That was lovely.
As I briefly said earlier, I'm always so fascinated by the degree to which and enriched, but also just kind of, I guess, happy, for lack of a better word, that when I hear a commentator or something, using elements of African American vernacular English on the television or something, and it's like, well, maybe we can maybe we can make small inroads all the time toward a better understanding of each other. They're minute and they don't happen quickly enough, but maybe occasionally they happen.
I have to ask, are you remembering African American commentators using African American English?
Yes, I was just specifically thinking of, CNN has, I'm really embarrassed, I'm forgetting his name, the African American political commentator.
Van?
Yes, Van, thank you.
I forget his last name.
Yeah, I can't think of his last name either right now. Anyway, he's so eloquent, and he's one of the narrators or commentators, possibly is a better word, on the new CNN special about Abraham Lincoln.
Okay.
And I was just noticing the degree to which he was code switching on this last Sunday's episode between, very elevated, precisely mainstream academic English to these just, hints and suggestions of African American vernacular. And it's so effective when we use language that richly and we code switch, we convey so much more meaning. Word choice conveys meaning as much as word tone. Van Jones, thank you Melodonna. Word choice conveys meaning as much as sometimes syntactic choice conveys all these extra rich pragmatic meanings. And syntax or semantics aren't just these one-way streets where there's this one correct usage and there's this one correct word. Different things will have a lot of power in terms of richness in different contexts.
That's great. Yeah, I want to thank everybody for their time, or we might end up being here the rest of the evening. But one final round of applause for Dr. Sperry.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. This has been so fun.
Yeah, this was really great. We will provide you with the recording or a link to the recording.
Okay, great.
so
Thank
we
you.
have it. And
I don't like listening to myself, but I think
Yeah.
my wife wants to listen.
But thanks so much for coming. It was fantastic.
Oh, it's been my pleasure entirely. And I'll just, when we get over this COVID thing, I'll just bombard you on campus someday.
Okay, that would be
wonderful. We can
great.
finally take you out to dinner.
Okay.
Yes.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you,
very
everyone.
much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
All right. Goodbye.
Thank you.